Introduction to Windows PowerShell. In this module, we'll look at what PowerShell is and why it's so important to you as a Windows or server administrator. We'll look specifically at the old way of administering things versus the new PowerShell way of administering them. And we'll talk about what PowerShell is, not so much a command line interface or even a scripting language, but rather an engine for performing administration on servers and on Windows. We'll look at a few of the existing and forthcoming PowerShell products, and we'll get right down to some basics by getting Windows PowerShell installed and running on Windows Server 2008, although I'll also show you how to do it on Windows XP, Windows Vista, and Windows Server 2003, and we'll look at customizing the shell to meet your needs. Now I know you already know how to use the Active Directory Users and Computers console to create a new user in Active Directory. But I want to walk through that process to sort of illustrate a few important points about the old way of administering servers. So we'll go to the Start menu, Administrative Tools, and open the Active Directory Users and Computers console. I'm going to go into this Singers OU, right-click to create a new user. Now you can see that I've already got John, Paul, and Ringo, so I guess that just leaves us with George Harrison. So this is typically the way you accomplish things in a GUI. You click a couple buttons or an icon, or you right-click. A dialog box comes up where you fill in the information you want. Maybe it's a wizard-style dialog box, which is kind of what this is, since it's got a couple of screens. And when you're finished, there's the new object. Of course, that wasn't getting everything for the new user. If I want to modify any of the other properties for a user, I have to right-click, select Properties, go to, say, the Organization tab, and fill in the company Beatles and click OK. Now there's a couple of things that are nice about this experience. If I really don't know what I'm doing, but I find myself in this tool, I can hover over these different icons to find out what they do with the little tooltip. I can kind of poke around through the menu to discover the different things I have available. I can right-click things and see some of the different things I can do. I can add this user to a group. I can copy the user, disable his account, reset the password. I'm able to explore or discover inside this graphical user interface without actually taking any actions. And that's really the nice thing that a graphical user interface offers, is this discoverability. The thing that a graphical user interface does not offer is any real kind of automation. It's very difficult to automate going to a particular location on the screen, right-clicking a particular thing, selecting a particular thing from a menu. In other words, sort of automating this GUI is difficult. Now, how long would you say that it took me to create George there? Probably, I don't know, 30 seconds. If I was going to fill in a lot of these properties, description, office, his address, maybe some profile information, telephone information, more information about his organization, if I were filling in more information, it might take me as long as a minute to create that one user. Now, a minute to create a user is not that bad of a thing, but what if I needed to create 10 users or 500 users? There's no way to speed up the operation in the GUI, other than just getting really good at clicking really fast. So if it takes me a minute to create one user, it probably takes me 500 minutes to create 500 users. And what's worse is, every time I go through this process of opening the properties and tabbing through these different tabs and filling things in, because I'm doing it manually, it's really easy to maybe skip one. Maybe on the 300th user, I go right from the General tab to the Organization tab, and I skip the address. That results in inconsistencies. Depending on what I'm configuring, maybe the Dial-In tab, it might result in inconsistencies that have a negative security impact. So there's a lot of bad things about a GUI. Now, it's true that Microsoft definitely gives us tools to help automate that particular process. There's the LDIF tool and the CSV tool that allow you to import users or other objects from a CSV file or an LDIF file. The problem is, it takes a little bit of time to learn how to use that command line utility, and that's the only thing it's good for. If I needed to automate something in DNS, for example, I can't use LDIF to do it. So what tools we do have for automation tend to be really narrowly focused. Let me kind of illustrate this so you understand how we got that way. It really starts when Microsoft develops the product itself. They start by developing the product's functionality. And let's step away for AD for a minute and take Exchange Server as an example here. So Microsoft starts by developing Exchange. And what does that mean? Well, there are probably some background services. There are definitely some databases. There's probably some configuration data. All the kind of under the hood stuff that makes it work. And then for administration, Microsoft starts by writing a graphical user interface. And the one we're used to is the one that we were just in, snap-ins to the Microsoft Management Console. And the reason Microsoft does that isn't because all the product groups at Microsoft got together and had a big hug one day and decided to use the MMC. It was because there's a document at Microsoft called the Common Engineering Criteria. And back before Windows 2000 was created, the Common Engineering Criteria was updated to say that all administration had to be built as a snap-in to the Microsoft Management Console. And the intent was to provide some consistency as well as give us administrators the ability to create sort of a master console with whatever snap-ins that we needed. So that's what Microsoft does first. And the thing is that anything you need to do with this product is exposed right in the GUI. And we've already talked about how the GUI is not an ideal platform for automation. And Microsoft knows that we need to automate certain tasks. So sometimes they'll give us an executable, a command line executable. If they think that we're into scripting, maybe we'll get a WMI provider. Or maybe for VBScript or Kickstart or Perl, we'll get a COM object. And on top of these automation tools or automation APIs, we can write maybe batch files, or if we're maybe a little bit more advanced, we can write VBScript files. The problem with this approach is that, like that LDIF tool, the executable really only covers a small portion of what Exchange can do. The WMI provider only covers a small portion of the product. The COM object, if there is one, might even overlap functionality with WMI, but again only touches a small fraction of the product. So our only choices for automation are those things that a Microsoft development team decided we would automate. And if they couldn't imagine what we needed to do, or if they couldn't think of a use case for what we needed to do, or if they just flat out couldn't come up with enough time to give us more tools, well then we can't automate those other things. So this idea of building the GUI and the automation layer in parallel is ultimately what creates the problem, and that's the problem Windows PowerShell sets out to solve. Under the new way of developing products, Microsoft still starts with the basic product functionality. I mean, it's obviously got to come first. But on top of it, their next step is to build a Windows PowerShell layer. That layer has full coverage of everything the product knows how to do. If you can do it in Exchange, and specifically I'm referring to Exchange 2007, which was the first product built around this model. If you can do it in Exchange, then you can do it in PowerShell. That means we now can use a command line interface to do anything in Windows PowerShell, which means we can also write scripts to do anything in Windows PowerShell. And what's kind of missing here? The graphical user interface? Well, look, the name of the product is still Windows. Microsoft isn't trying to take the GUI away from people. And like I said, the GUI has a lot of benefits, especially for doing tasks that maybe you don't do that frequently, or for a new administrator who's really just learning how to do things. The thing is, the GUI can also sit on top of Windows PowerShell because of the way Windows PowerShell is designed. In fact, the Exchange 2007 GUI is actually just a pretty lightweight wizard that runs Windows PowerShell commands under the hood. In fact, there's a button you can click on most Exchange GUI dialog boxes, and it'll show you the command it's about to run to do whatever it is you asked it to do. You could copy and paste that same command right into the PowerShell command line interface, run it yourself, and have exactly the same effect, because all of the administration is actually being done by PowerShell. We just have three different ways that we can tell PowerShell what to do: a command line interface, scripts, and a GUI. So by building products in this fashion, Microsoft really enables full-fledged automation while still allowing for a graphical user interface. Now, it's obviously a big deal for Microsoft product teams to build a product in this way. I mean, they pretty much have to go back to scratch. And that's very expensive, it's very time-consuming, it's very risky. So this model is what I call the Phase 2 model. And later on in this nugget, we'll talk about some of the products that have been built in the Phase 2 way. But there's kind of another interim model you'll see that I call Phase 1. In this model, the product team obviously starts with whatever base functionality they need. Let's say it's SQL Server, and this has got whatever services and data and configuration and everything else. And they've already built a lot of really robust graphical user interfaces on top of this. In the case of SQL, they've got this T-SQL script language. They've got some command line utilities. And in SQL Server 2008 at least, they're also adding some PowerShell support. Now you'll notice that PowerShell is not the center of the universe here. The GUI is often talking directly to SQL Server, or it's running T-SQL commands, which are talking directly to SQL Server. The executable command line utilities are talking directly to SQL Server, and PowerShell is talking directly to SQL Server. The GUI doesn't really cover all of what SQL can do, although it covers most of it. The command line executables really don't cover all of what SQL Server can do. And PowerShell, in this case, doesn't cover all of what SQL Server can do. It's only addressing a subset. And this is okay. This is a Phase 1 approach. As the SQL product itself goes into future versions, PowerShell will get more and more and more functionality until it finally does have that full coverage of a more Phase 2 product, and PowerShell becomes really the center of the universe for administration. And that whole kind of center of the universe model is really why I like to call PowerShell an administrative engine. Let me show you what I mean. In an ideal world, a Phase 2 product like Exchange Server, Windows PowerShell sits right at the middle. It contains all of the product's administrative functionality. It's the only thing really talking to the product. There's a lot of different ways we can interact with PowerShell. We've got the option to use a command line interface to manually type commands. We can run PS1 files, which are scripts that run commands. A graphical user interface can be built that just runs PowerShell commands under the hood. There are other applications that someone might run or write that are going to need to administer Exchange. Maybe it's part of a bigger provisioning process that creates users, creates home drives, creates mailboxes, and so it'll need to interface with Exchange, and it can do it through PowerShell behind the scenes. There are probably things that we haven't even thought of yet that can do anything they need to do, so long as they do it through Windows PowerShell. So don't think of PowerShell as strictly a command line interface. It's really a central engine. The way that you're going to probably use it most visibly is a command line interface or scripts, but PowerShell also enables graphical user interfaces, other applications, and things we haven't even dreamed of yet, all centralizing the administrative functionality in one place in a consistent fashion so that any of these things have got equal ability to manage a particular server product. That's really the model that PowerShell aims for. And in Phase 2 products, where they're fully PowerShelled, this is the functionality you really get. So what are some Windows PowerShell products? Well, it might surprise you to learn that the one we're looking at right now, Windows Server 2008, is not a PowerShelled product. And that's simply because Windows Server 2008 was almost done by the time PowerShell was ready, and it's a big deal to go back and rewrite administrative functionality in PowerShell. I mean, you not only have to write the PowerShell bits of it, the things that allow PowerShell to touch the product, you also have to rewrite all of your graphical user interfaces to talk to PowerShell instead of talking directly to the product. So subsequent versions of Windows Server will be more PowerShelled, and we know that because that Common Engineering Criteria document, the thing that required all the GUIs to be in the MMC, well, the CEC now requires administrative functionality to be built in PowerShell, so it will happen over time. But let's talk about who's already there. We already said that everyone's favorite messaging product, Exchange Server 2007, is a PowerShell product, and that's actually a Phase 2, which means it's fully enabled for Windows PowerShell. Other Phase 2 products include System Center Virtual Machine Manager, System Center Data Protection Manager, and to a degree System Center Operations Manager. There's third-party products out there that support Windows PowerShell too. You may have heard of something called VMware, and they offer a scripting toolkit that allows their ESX server product to be administered through Windows PowerShell. Citrix has written some Windows PowerShell commandlets, as has F5 Networks. These are all what I would call more Phase 1. Not all of the administrative functionality is going directly through Windows PowerShell, but you can do most of what you need to do with Windows PowerShell. Microsoft has some other products that are more in the Phase 1 area too. System Center Configuration Manager, SQL Server 2008. These all provide some PowerShell functionality, but they're not fully PowerShelled. Over time, they'll pick up more and more PowerShell capability, just like other Microsoft products will. So this is kind of where you are now. Now what we do know, again, is that future versions of Windows will do things like DNS, DHCP, terminal services, certificate services. Pretty much anything you can imagine in Windows will eventually be administrable through PowerShell. So while the world of PowerShell right now is somewhat small, it's getting bigger. Third parties are jumping on, more Microsoft products, future Microsoft products. And if you think that, well, okay, I'm not an Exchange administrator, so I don't need to learn Windows PowerShell, here's something else to think about. Windows PowerShell can already tap into a number of different existing administrative technologies, like WMI, or the Active Directory Services Interface, or the Microsoft .NET Framework. Windows PowerShell can also tap into legacy technologies like the component object model. So there are a lot of things that you can administer now in Windows, even though Windows hasn't been specifically redone in a PowerShell-centric kind of sense of the term. Now let's get Windows PowerShell installed. If you're using Windows XP, Windows Vista, or Windows Server 2003, you'll start by going to www.microsoft.com/PowerShell. That's the Windows PowerShell homepage, and it's where you'll find the Download Windows PowerShell link. You're going to need to know two things in order to get the right download. The first thing you'll need to know is what operating system you're using, Vista, XP, or Server 2003. And the second thing is the platform you're on. Are you running the x86 or 32-bit build, or x64 or 64-bit build? As you can see, there's a separate build for each operating system and each platform. The Windows Server 2003 build also has an Itanium option. Now you may have noticed that Windows Server 2008 isn't listed here. And it doesn't need to be, because Windows PowerShell actually ships with Windows Server 2008, although it's not installed by default. To install it, I'm going to go to the Server Manager. Now I have the Windows Server 2008 installation source installed on this computer's hard drive. If you don't, keep in mind that you may need the Windows Server 2008 DVD in order to complete this process. So I'll click on Features, and then Add a Feature. The .NET Framework 3.0 feature is already installed, so I don't have to worry about that. However, if it's not installed, selecting the Windows PowerShell option will automatically select the .NET Framework. Windows PowerShell on any operating system requires version 2 or higher of the .NET Framework as a prerequisite. You can have later versions. Version 3 or 3.5, for example, will work fine. So now that I've selected Windows PowerShell in the list, I'll hit Next. Go ahead and click Install. This will take a few minutes to install. And something that's kind of interesting about Windows PowerShell's installation is that it installs kind of as a hot fix or an update to the operating system. It's actually considered a core part of the Windows operating system. That means it's possible in theory that a hot fix or service pack in the future will actually include patches or updates to Windows PowerShell. Once this installation finishes, in fact, you'll see a little warning message that kind of highlights what I'm talking about there with it being a core part of the operating system. So this message indicates that Windows PowerShell was successfully installed. And the reason I got a warning is because I have got Windows Automatic Updates turned off for this server. Well, Server Manager knows that Windows PowerShell could potentially be updated by automatic updates, and so it's just warning me that, hey, Windows Automatic Updating is not enabled. Keep in mind that although you've installed this component, you've installed it using the bits that were on the original DVD. There might be updates out there, so you might want to think about enabling automatic updating so that those updates can come through. We'll go ahead and close this wizard. And now in the feature summary you can see that Windows PowerShell is installed. So it's actually ready to go at this point. Before I start really using PowerShell though, I want to just kind of take a look at it, get familiar with it. I'll find it on the All Programs menu under Windows PowerShell, and there's the Windows PowerShell icon. The first thing we're going to notice is that the window is actually bigger than my desktop. So that's probably something we're going to want to take care of. Let me kind of move this down, and just like any other window, I can grab the corner and resize the window, kind of get it positioned where I want it. Now I'm going to give you a little preview of a Windows PowerShell command that we'll talk about in a later nugget. This one's called get event log, and I'm going to ask it to get the security event log. Now there's obviously a lot of stuff in the security event log, so pressing Control-C will interrupt this. Control-C is definitely a good key press to keep in mind. One thing I'm kind of noticing here is that all the text is scrolling off the side, and I have this horizontal scroll bar at the bottom that's letting me get over and see it. You might like that. That might be the perfect way for you to let it fill up more text than will actually fit on the screen, and you can just scroll horizontally to see it. I'm not a big fan of this. So here's where customizing the shell comes in. Just click the little icon in the upper left corner of the window and select Properties. The tab we're going to start with is Layout. You'll notice that this window is 94 characters wide physically, but it has a logical width of 120 characters. That's why PowerShell is allowing the text to scroll off the edge. PowerShell thinks that the window can contain 120 characters, even though it only physically fits 94, and that's where the horizontal scroll bar comes into play. Because I like to get rid of the horizontal scroll bar, I'm just going to change both of these values to be the same thing. And when I hit OK, you see that that horizontal scroll bar goes away. Now if I run that same get event log command again, this time there's no horizontal scrolling. I still get this ... stuff because the text wasn't wide enough to fit, but we'll be looking at how to take care of that later. Right now, let's look at some more customizing options in this Properties. You can change the font, either using a TrueType Lucida console font or some of the built-in raster fonts. So if the existing font is too big or too small, you can find one that meets your needs. You can also change the colors. The screen color by default is a dark blue, and the foreground color by default is white. I kind of like to leave them that way. I know some folks like to change it to a black background because it has more contrast. I don't like to do that though because the built-in command prompt, the old command.exe, has a black window with this sort of white or light gray text. By allowing PowerShell to keep a separate color scheme, it kind of reminds me which of the two shells I'm using, so I don't get confused and start trying to run the wrong command in the wrong place. You can pick whatever colors you like though. And to sort of wrap up here, aside from colors and the layout and the font, you have a few options. You can change the size of the command history buffer. That's the number of commands that are automatically remembered that you can quickly recall to run that command again. You can change the cursor size. You can have this window automatically come up in a window or have it automatically come up full screen. And then you've got two options that are enabled by default: Quick Edit Mode and Insert Mode. I'll show you what those are. Let me scroll back down to my command, scroll back up to my command rather, and I'm just going to left click in the window, and this starts Quick Edit Mode. I can drag to select and then hit Enter to copy that to the clipboard. To paste that into the shell, I'm just going to right click. That's a great way to copy a command, say out of Windows Notepad or off of a website, and paste it into the shell. By leaving those two options, Quick Edit and Insert, configured, you're able to do that. Use the cursor to back up, insert new text, delete text, run the command again. So those quick edits are really nice to get commands out of the shell into Notepad, where you can save it in a file for use later. It's a great way to quickly copy things from other locations, paste them into the shell, modify them to meet your needs, and then run them. In this nugget, we looked at the old way of administering Windows and servers and the new way that Windows PowerShell enables. We saw how PowerShell is more than just a command line interface or a scripting language. It's an administrative engine that enables a number of different administrative surfaces to share a common set of functionality. We looked at some of the PowerShell products, both the Phase 1 products that are implementing some PowerShell support, as well as the Phase 2 products that are completely built on PowerShell for their administration. We got Windows PowerShell installed and running, and we customized the shell to meet our display requirements. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.